Imagine two people sitting in the same room, hearing the same piece of bad news at the exact same moment. One of them goes completely still, takes a breath, and starts thinking through their next move. The other one grabs their phone, starts making frantic calls, and begins making decisions they'll deeply regret by morning. Same room, same news, completely different outcomes. What separates those two people isn't intelligence, it isn't experience, and it definitely isn't luck. It's one single rule that most people have never been taught, and once you understand it, you'll never look at pressure the same way again. Let's start with something that almost everyone gets wrong about stress. Most people believe that calm under pressure is a personality trait. They think some people are just naturally wired to stay composed while others are destined to fall apart. That belief is incredibly convenient because it removes all personal responsibility. If calmness is just something you're born with, then there's nothing to learn, nothing to practice, and no one to hold accountable. But that belief is also completely false, and the evidence for that shows up every single day in how people handle money, careers, relationships, and unexpected setbacks. The rule that actually decides who panics and who doesn't has nothing to do with genetics or temperament. It has everything to do with how a person has structured their life before the pressure arrived. Think about that for a second. The response to a crisis is almost always decided long before the crisis happens. The person who stays calm didn't suddenly develop a superpower when things went wrong. They built something in advance that gave them options when the moment arrived. And the person who panicked? They walked into that moment without that structure, and their nervous system had no choice but to go into survival mode. Here's the rule in its most basic form. When your identity, your stability, or your survival feels like it depends on one single outcome, any threat to that outcome will feel catastrophic. And catastrophic feelings produce catastrophic decisions. But when you've built your life so that no single outcome controls everything, threats feel manageable. And manageable threats produce measured responses. This is why two investors can watch the same market drop in the same week and react in completely opposite ways. One of them has their entire sense of financial security tied to the performance of that one portfolio. Every red number feels like a personal attack on their future. So they sell. They bail out. They lock in losses because their nervous system demanded relief from the discomfort. The other investor looks at the same numbers and sees a temporary shift in a long pattern they've studied and prepared for. They don't feel the same pressure because their financial structure doesn't depend on short-term performance. One of them made a poor financial decision rooted in panic. The other made a disciplined choice rooted in preparation. Now let's go deeper. Because this rule doesn't just apply to money. It applies to careers, to health decisions, to relationships, to every single area where pressure shows up. When someone is in a job they desperately need because they have no savings, no backup plan, and no transferable skills they've invested in, their relationship with that job becomes one of pure survival. Any threat to that job, a difficult manager, a company restructuring, a bad performance review, triggers a level of anxiety that makes it nearly impossible to think clearly. That person can't advocate for themselves effectively because they're operating from fear. Their choices narrow. Their communication suffers. Their judgment gets clouded. Contrast that with someone who has spent years quietly building an emergency fund, developing skills outside their primary role, and maintaining professional relationships across multiple industries. When that same difficult manager shows up, they feel something completely different. They still feel the discomfort, but they don't feel trapped. And people who don't feel trapped make far better decisions than people who do. They can have honest conversations. They can draw reasonable boundaries. They can walk away if necessary. Their calm isn't passive. It's powered by the groundwork they laid in advance. This is the deeper truth that most financial education misses. People talk endlessly about investment strategies, tax efficiency, compound interest, and passive income streams. Those things matter. But underneath all of it, the most important financial principle isn't a strategy at all. It's structural resilience. The deliberate practice of building your life in layers so that no single layer collapsing brings everything down with it. Think about how a building withstands a storm. It's not because the building is hoping the storm won't be too bad. It's because the engineers who designed it accounted for pressure loads, wind resistance, and structural redundancy long before any storm arrived. They built in safeguards. They made the foundation capable of absorbing shocks that the walls and windows couldn't handle alone. Personal finances, careers, and emotional stability work the same way. The people who don't panic aren't hoping for easy conditions. They engineered themselves for hard ones. So how does someone actually build this kind of structure? Let's talk about that practically, because the concept is only valuable if it translates into real life. The first layer is financial buffer. This sounds simple, and it is simple, but most people underestimate how profoundly it changes their psychology. When you have 3 to 6 months of living expenses sitting somewhere accessible, your entire relationship with risk changes. You can think longer term. You can tolerate short-term discomfort in a job or an investment without making impulsive decisions. That buffer isn't just money. It's mental bandwidth. It's the difference between thinking from a place of abundance and thinking from a place of scarcity. The second layer is identity diversification. This one is less talked about but just as important. When a person's entire self-worth is tied to one role, whether that's their job title, their business, their relationship, or their social status, any threat to that role feels existential. And existential threats don't produce thoughtful responses. They produce desperate ones. People who stay calm under pressure have usually developed a sense of self that doesn't collapse when one part of their life comes under strain. They are not just their job. They are not just their income level. They have developed skills, relationships, interests, and values that remain intact even when external circumstances shift. The third layer is what might be called practiced exposure. This is the principle that familiarity reduces fear. When you've deliberately put yourself in uncomfortable situations, taken on small calculated risks, had difficult conversations voluntarily, made decisions under low-stakes pressure, your nervous system builds a reference library of experiences where discomfort didn't destroy you. Over time, that library becomes evidence. Evidence that you've been through hard things before and come out functional on the other side. So when real, high-stakes pressure arrives, your brain doesn't treat it as completely unknown territory. It pulls from that library and says, "We've navigated something like this before." That familiarity is calming in a way that no amount of positive thinking ever could be. Now let's address something that comes up often when this topic gets discussed. People sometimes confuse calm under pressure with being emotionally flat or detached. That's not what this is about. The goal isn't to eliminate emotion. Emotion is useful information. Fear tells you something is at stake. Discomfort signals that something needs attention. The goal is to stop emotion from becoming the decision maker. There's a meaningful difference between feeling afraid and letting fear choose your next move. The most effective people in any field, investors, surgeons, entrepreneurs, athletes, all feel the pressure. But they've built enough internal and external structure that the emotion informs them without controlling them. This distinction matters enormously in long-term wealth building. Poor financial decisions don't usually come from a lack of knowledge. They come from emotional states making choices that rational thinking would reject entirely. Someone who panic sells a diversified portfolio during a temporary market correction isn't ignorant about investing. In that moment, they're overwhelmed. Their nervous system overrode their logic. The solution isn't to study more investing theory. It's to build the kind of financial foundation and psychological resilience that gives logic a fighting chance when emotions rise. There's another dimension to this that rarely gets discussed honestly. Panic is often contagious. When pressure hits a group, a family, a team, a community, the people who stay calm don't just benefit themselves. They become stabilizing forces for everyone around them. One grounded voice in a room full of anxiety can redirect the entire conversation. One person who pauses, thinks, and suggests a measured next step can interrupt a cascade of poor collective decision-making. This is why calmness under pressure is not just a personal virtue. It's a form of leadership, and in many ways, it's the most important form, the kind that shows up not when things are going well but precisely when everything seems to be falling apart. Consider what happens in households when an unexpected financial shock arrives. A job loss, a medical expense, a business downturn. In households where no preparation was made, that shock often triggers blame, fear, and a series of short-term reactions that make the long-term situation worse. Expensive debt gets taken on to cover immediate gaps. Assets get liquidated at the worst possible time. Decisions get made from the bottom of an emotional valley rather than from a stable place. But in households where even modest preparation existed, a buffer, a plan, a shared understanding of what the priorities are, the same shock gets handled differently. Not easily, but systematically. The stress is real, but it doesn't become chaos. And here's what's particularly important to understand. The preparation doesn't need to be perfect to change the outcome. Even partial preparation dramatically shifts the psychological experience of a crisis. A modest emergency fund doesn't eliminate financial pressure, but it stretches the timeline enough to prevent panic-driven choices. A career with a couple of marketable skills beyond the primary role doesn't guarantee job security, but it reduces the feeling of being completely trapped. The goal isn't to build an impenetrable wall. The goal is to build enough structure that your nervous system doesn't immediately go into full survival mode the moment something goes wrong. This is the wealth-building principle that the most financially stable people quietly understand and consistently apply. It's not about finding the highest return or the most clever investment vehicle. It's about building a life that has enough layers, enough redundancy, and enough stability that when pressure arrives, and pressure always arrives, they're responding from a position of relative strength rather than desperate vulnerability. The rule, stated plainly one final time: the person who panics is almost always the person who built no slack into their system. The person who stays calm almost always built slack in advance, whether that slack is financial, psychological, social, or professional. Slack is not laziness. Slack is not inefficiency. Slack is the deliberate space between where you are and the edge, the margin that allows you to think rather than just react. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this: the work that determines how you respond to pressure doesn't happen during the crisis. It happens in the quiet moments before it. Every time you build an emergency fund instead of spending every available dollar, you are deciding in advance that future pressure won't own you. Every time you develop a skill outside your comfort zone, you are investing in future calmness. Every time you have a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, you are training your nervous system to handle discomfort without shutting down. These aren't dramatic moves. They're quiet, consistent, long-term choices, and they're the ones that matter most. You don't have to be fearless to stay calm when it counts. You just have to be prepared. And preparation is a choice available to almost anyone willing to start making it today. The people around you who seem to handle pressure effortlessly didn't get lucky with their personality. They got deliberate with their decisions. And so can you. If this way of thinking about pressure, preparation, and financial resilience resonated with you, please take a second to like this video. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of content. Drop a comment below with the one area of your life where you most want to build more resilience, whether that's financial, professional, or personal. And if you want to keep building this mindset with videos designed around long-term thinking and practical financial awareness, subscribe and stay with us. The next one is worth your time.